Okay, welcome to the next lecture in our unit on arguments pertaining to philosophy and religion, specifically arguments for and against God's existence. And in this lecture, we're going to look at a famous style of argument called cosmological arguments. And we're going to look specifically at an argument which I'll call the causal argument today. So let's just get started. What today we call cosmological arguments are so called because their defenders are seeking an account of the cosmos, or the universe as a whole, basically. So these arguments are arguments for the existence of God, and I think basically the arguments purport to argue that the reason or the account, the explanation for the existence of the cosmos or the universe is God. So these arguments have two important features. One, they are what philosophers call a posteriori arguments. That just means after experience. They're truths known through experience, or they're truths, they're beliefs that you get justified through experience. So they depend on truths known by our experience of the actual world. So the premises of these arguments are like this arguments you would find in many of the physical sciences like biology, cosmology, chemistry, that requires observations of some sort. This is in contrast to what are called a priori arguments, which don't depend on empirical truths or truths known through empirical methods. Instead, they're truths acquired through non-empirical methods. And the best example we have of that, of a really successful body of knowledge, would be mathematics. Mathematics doesn't rely on observation. Mathematical proofs aren't justified through observations. Even though a mathematician might use a pen and paper, they don't need to, at least in principle. So cosmological arguments then are a posteriori. Ooh, I got an email. They have another feature though. They're deductive. So if in a deductive argument, if the premises are true, and in a valid deductive argument, if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. This is in contrast to another style of argument called inductive arguments, where the conclusion is merely rendered probable by the premises, but it isn't rendered certain. So that's the two features of cosmological arguments then. They have empirical a posteriori premises, and they are deductive in form. Alright, let's get on to the argument then. Think about the universe we live in for a moment, or for more than a moment. I hope you've thought about this before, but think about it. Now that we're in a philosophy class, now is the appropriate time. So take a step back, pause, think hard about the cosmos.
Space, says the introduction to the Hitchhiker's Guide, is big. Really big. You just won't believe how vastly, hugely, mind-bogglingly big it is, and so on. It also says that if you hold a lung full of air, you can survive in the total vacuum of space for about 30 seconds. But with space being really big and all, the chances of being picked up within that time are 2 to the power of 2,079,460,347 to 1 against.
It's a big universe we live in, with all these planets and galaxies and stars and people and plants and mountains and atoms. I know. But I want you to notice something about these planets and stars and people and plants and mountains and so on, real quick. I want to draw attention to a feature. They don't just randomly pop into existence, okay? So it's not like time 0, there's nothing going on. Time 1, nothing's going on. Time 2, oh my gosh! A baby just popped into existence. No, we don't live in a universe like that. Something else brings them about. In the case of babies, it is parents that bring them about. In the case of mountains, it's, plate tectonic activity that brings about the mountains. So, and I think this is, I'm getting at a principle that I think you all endorse, implicitly or explicitly. You assume this principle even if you've never, reflected upon it. So suppose one morning you woke up and you saw this in your backyard. It's a chocolate river. Your response would probably be, oh my gosh, what caused this chocolate river I see? What brought this about? Ooh, I got another email. Of course, you could also ask the question, what caused X, about anything, not just weird stuff. So you don't have to ask about abnormal or unusual stuff like a chocolate river showing up in your backyard one morning. You could also ask it about, pencils and apples and sushi and any other thing you normally encounter in your day-to-day life. So it's a principle that it's a question you can generalize. For anything that exists, one can ask, what caused this? And this question can be generalized to the universe. The universe exists. So what caused the universe? Well, here's a candidate argument. Premise 1, the physical universe exists, and so it must have a cause. Premise 2, that cause is God. Conclusion 3, therefore God exists. Well, how successful is this argument? It needs some revision. Actually, as an argument, this sucks. Alright, first, the argument presupposes what it's intended to prove. Premise 2 asserts that cause is God. And the conclusion is, God exists. But as this is an argument that's purported to demonstrate that God exists, the argument can't assume that God exists, so the argument is question-begging. Now remember in the unit on logic and argumentation, we talked about the 3 good-making features of an argument. One was validity, another was soundness, and the third feature was convincingness. And this argument fails as a convincing argument. You can't prove what you assume to be true. Second, notice the contention in premise 1. The physical universe exists, and so it must have a cause. This needs some support. One reason we may hold that the universe must have a cause is because we believe that everything has a cause. But this presupposition might be plausible. But then we should explicitly hold this causal principle as a premise in our own argument then, which we haven't done. So, as it stands, that argument sucks. It's not convincing. Alright, but we can tweak it though. Don't give up. We can make it into a stronger argument. And to do this, let's consider a very old argument Aristotle offered about motion. Aristotle writes, if we look around us, we see that there are things in motion. Now, whatever is in motion must be moved by something else. But there can't be an infinite series of previous movers, each moved by another. So there must have been a first unmoved mover. There are 2 features of Aristotle's argument. There are 2 features of Aristotle's reasoning that we'd like a good causal argument to have. First, it argues for a being of a very special kind, without presupposing the existence of that being. Second, so in other words, Aristotle's reasoning here doesn't beg the question. It doesn't fail to be convincing in that regard. Second, the argument includes a universal principle, which is in the second sentence. Now, whatever is in motion must be moved by something else. That's a universal principle. And also, that principle just seems true. But it needs to be explicit in the causal argument, a principle like that universal principle, if the conclusion is to follow from the premises, in other words, if it's to be valid. So, a defender of the causal argument might reason analogously to the argument about motion. If we look around us, we see that there is a physical universe. Now, whatever exists has a cause, that is, something else which caused it. But there cannot be an infinite series of past causes, each the effect of a previous cause. So there must have been a first uncaused cause, and this being we'll call God. Alright, this argument has more potential, it's more promising. No one denies that there are planets and stars, mountains, people, and plants. It's also reasonable to ask in the physical universe what caused it. That's one of the reasons why the field of cosmology exists today, is to answer these questions. And the general principle that everything has a cause makes the question a reasonable question in and of itself. Finally, having offered an answer to what causes the universe, we can ask for the cause of that as well, but we can't ask the question over and over again. That series of past causes has to terminate somewhere. So then we can say that there must have been a first cause. It est a cause that is not itself cause, which we'll call God. And this is what philosophers of science call a theory's primitive or basic. It's something that's used to justify or explain other things but doesn't need explanation itself. And then in this argument, God plays that role. And many theories in many different fields of science have these basic or these primitives that do explanatory work or do causal work without being explained themselves. So this argument has a lot going on for it then. Well, let's make it a bit formal then. We'll tighten it up and we'll present it thus. Premise 1, the universe exists. Premise 2, everything that exists has a cause. Premise 3, there cannot be an infinite series of past causes. Conclusion 4, so there must have been a first uncaused cause, and we'll call that God. Well, there's a serious flaw in the argument, and I'll give a virtual high five to the first person to spot it. So take a look at it again. Aha! There's an inconsistency between premise 2 and the conclusion 4. Premise 2 says everything that exists has a cause, but premise 4 says there must have been a first uncaused cause. Well, the problem is if 2 is true, in which case everything that exists has a cause, then 4 is impossible. For 4 says that there's something that exists but doesn't have a cause. So if 2 is true, then 4 must be false. And if 4 is true, 2 must be false. So 2 and 4 contradict each other. Oh my. Well, here's a question. Maybe we could tweak the argument so they can avoid this inconsistency, but how might the defender of the causal argument do that? Well, one option would be to revise premise 2 as follows. We'll make premise 2, everything that exists except God has a cause. Okay? Well, that will certainly avoid the contradiction, but it has other problems. One, it just begs the question, which is what the first argument did, and we're trying to avoid that. It assumes what we're trying to prove, mainly that, God exists uncaused. So, just as the first argument we considered beg the question, it assumed what is to be proved, so does revising 2 to 2 hyphen. For 2 assumes what is to be proved, that God exists. Second, though, there seems to be little reason, except perhaps desperation, to demand causes for everything except God. That's what philosophers call ad hoc. It's a non-principled exception you make to a general rule. And it's okay to make exceptions to general rules if you have good reasons, but there doesn't seem to be any good principled reasons to do so. Why stop at God? Why not stop at the physical universe and say that everything except the physical universe exists uncaused? Of course, you won't have an argument for God's existence, but we need something more promising than that. So, desperation is a stinky cologne. Well, there's a second maneuver the defender of the causal argument could make, though. Initially, we've interpreted premise 2 to mean that everything that exists is caused by something else. Why not interpret premise 2 to mean that everything that exists is caused by something or other? In this case, we could conclude with a different conclusion, that there is a first cause, God, who is self-caused. God causes himself to exist. That makes matters worse. The only immediate obvious meaning to X is self-caused is that X causes, and so exists prior to X. So God causes himself to exist before God exists. But that presupposes that God exists before he exists. That's just contradictory again. So it's an incoherent notion, this whole notion of self-causation. So that won't do. Alright, well, we're back to square one then. And like I say, a thing cannot exist before itself. Well, I explained everything on the slide. Well, the futility of amending premise 2 suggests that there is something fundamentally wrong with the causal principle. What we need is a better causal principle. So let's reflect some more. Alright, think hard. Think really hard. But don't think too hard or you might grow a mustache. Done reflecting, we should see that physical objects like planets and stars and squirrels aren't caused at all. what? I said, now that we're done reflecting, we can see that physical objects like planets and stars and squirrels aren't caused at all. Again, what? Okay, let me explain. Instead, events or states of things are what are caused. So an event is a happening of some kind, such as falling, and a state is a way a thing is, like being tan. That's what's caused. It's not the universe that's caused, it's the universe coming to existence that's caused. Alright? Think of it that way. So when we say that you are caused, what we are really saying is that you are caused to come into existence, which is an event. And strictly speaking then, we shouldn't speak of objects being caused at all. Instead, we should say they're coming into existence is what is caused. So then our general causal principle should be about things caused to come into existence, instead of things being caused simplicator. Alright, so here's a slightly tweaked argument then, and I quote, "If we look around us, we see that there are physical things like people and trees and so on which were caused to exist. Now, whatever is caused to exist by something else. But just as we saw in the case of motion, where something unmoved must initially begin the motion of a thing, so it is here that no series of past causes can stretch infinitely far back in time. So an infinite regress of past causes is impossible. So there was a first cause. This first cause cannot be something that comes into existence, for then it would need some prior cause, and it cannot be self-caused, for that is incoherent. So it must be something that has always existed, causing other things to exist and yet not exist, not itself being brought into existence." Well, let's formalize the argument some. It's another four-premise argument. Premise 1. There are things which came into existence. Premise 2. Whatever comes into existence is caused to exist by something else. Premise 3. There cannot be an infinite series of past causes. Conclusion 4. So there was a first cause. We'll call that God. Alright, this argument has some punch to it. It seems really plausible. First off, it's valid. Of course, the question is it sound? Are the premises true? And premises 1 and 2 just seem true. Things do come into existence, and it just seems likely that something that comes into existence would be caused by something else. So premise 3 then is the premise in most need of defense. Because someone could ask, why can't there be an infinite series of past causes in time? Well, let's take a look at maybe a first defense of premise 3 then. You can go like this. It just seems like there cannot be an actual infinite number of anything. Because an actual infinite collection or series of things is incoherent. For example, suppose that there are an actual infinite number of red and white marbles in some huge expanse of space. Suppose the red marbles corresponded to the odd numbers, and the white marbles corresponded to the even numbers. Well, if all of the white marbles were to be taken away, an infinite amount, by the way, the remaining collection of marbles wouldn't actually be any smaller than before. Huh? Well, that's absurd. If you subtract half the marbles from an infinite collection of marbles, there'd literally be the same amount of marbles before you subtracted them. Now, it'd be nice if ATM machines worked that way. I'd take half my money, but I have the same money left over. But it doesn't. That's absurd. For example, if you subtract half of 8 from 8, you don't get 8, you get 4. But in the case of an infinite number of red and white marbles, subtracting the infinite amount of white marbles results in an infinite number of marbles left. So infinity minus infinity equals infinity. That's just bizarre. It should be infinity minus infinity equals 0. But in this case, it's not. So instead of holding that there are actual infinites, it's better to just posit potential infinites. You can keep on counting as long as you'd like, and you'll always end up at a finite number, though, no matter how large. For every finite number, there's always one greater. That doesn't mean it's possible that there's an actual infinite number of things. Well, this first defense makes a very strong claim. Mainly that actual infinites are not possible. But the question is this a necessary truth? That there are no actual infinites? I say no. It's just not obvious where a contradiction would be in positing actual infinites. Some bizarre stuff, but nothing contradictory. So it's weird, but not contradictory. Plus, it does seem that there is an infinite number of something, mainly the numbers. There's an infinite number of numbers. But there's no internal contradictions in there being this infinite number of numbers. So if there are no contradictions in an infinite series of numbers, then there's no contradiction in an infinite series of past causes either. Well, maybe we can do better. Maybe there's a better defense of premise 3. We'll try it like this. Everybody agrees that an infinite series doesn't have an end. It doesn't have a terminus or point of completion. But the series of past events does terminate, mainly at the present moment. So that series cannot be infinite. Alright. Okay. Let's formalize that argument some then. It's another 4-premise argument, and I'll read it step by step. Premise 1. By definition, an infinite series doesn't have an end or point of completion. Because it's infinite. It's never ending. Okay? If it had an endpoint, then it would be finite. Premise 2. So any series which does have a terminus cannot be an infinite series. Alright? Premise 3. But the series of past causes in time does have a terminus, namely now. Conclusion 4. So the series of past causes in time cannot be infinite. Alright, this argument's valid, but it's not sound. The question is, which premise is false? Well, consider again the positive and negative integers. The infinite series of positive integers, 1, 2, 3, and so on, does not have a point of completion. It goes on forever. But so it doesn't have an end. But it's got a beginning. It's got a boundary, a first element, the number 1. The same goes with the infinite series of negative integers. Negative 1, negative 2, negative 3. It doesn't have a point of beginning, but has a point of completion, negative 1. So premises 1 and 2 in the previous argument then have to be false. So much for that argument. Well, there's one other objection to the causal argument, though, and it actually has to do with the conclusion. So it's what philosophers would call a rebutting defeater. So there's 2 ways to challenge an argument, as I said. You can challenge the premises, or you can challenge the conclusion. When you challenge the premise of an argument, it's called a defeater. And then when you challenge the conclusion of an argument, it's called a rebutting defeater. Well, this is a rebutting defeater. So it goes like this. Recall the conclusion 4. Recall the conclusion. So there was a first cause, which we'll call God. Well, can anyone think of why this conclusion isn't the conclusion the theist wants? The conclusion that God exists? And the resources to answer this question were already given in this lecture, if you think about it. Alright. Well, even if we do identify the first cause with God, the conclusion 4 is still consistent with this claim. God does not now exist. Let me explain why. Alright, let's go back. There are things which came into existence. Past tense, came. Alright. So suppose I managed to prove that there was a Sahara forest, which there is now a giant desert. I want to thereby prove that there is now a huge forest in Africa called the Sahara forest. Similarly, if we want to prove that there is now a God that exists, the argument needs to be appropriately formulated. But all we can get from the fact that the universe came into existence is that God existed, past tense. But we want God to exist now. So suppose that we could have the conclusion that theist wants, there is a first cause God. We can't get that. We can only infer that there was a God. There was this divine being that caused the universe to come into existence. But that doesn't mean that God exists now. Alright. Second objection to the conclusion. There's another problem with it. And again, the resources are already given in this lecture. So suppose we could have the conclusion the theist wants. There is a first cause, God. There's another problem. Recall, objects aren't caused. Instead, events or states are caused. So events like falling or states like being tan are what are caused. Your falling, which is the effect, is caused by your tripping, a previous event. which is the cause. So events or states are causes, not objects. Happenings or things being a certain way can cause other occurrences or things to be a certain way. All right? So when we say that X causes Y, the cause X and the effect Y are events or states. So clearly then, we do not wish to identify God with the first cause. That would make God an event or a state, but God's not an event or a state. God's an object. He's an entity, a thing, okay? It isn't the parents who cause a baby to come into existence, recall. Instead, after a romantic date and a walk by the moonlight and a few glasses of wine and some romantic music and some candles and, a slight breeze, it's the parents' action of anyways, God's not an event or state. Instead, God's a very powerful being. So it seems that 4 concludes with the existence of a being of the sort the theist does not want after all. The end.